From the St. Francis Yacht Club in San Francisco, this is the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon, hosted by Ron Young.
Welcome to the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon, live from the virtual grill room of the St. Francis Yacht Club. We hope that you and yours are sheltering in place in a comfortable environment, and we look forward to greeting you back in the grill room just as soon as conditions permit. Our speaker today has served the sailing community for decades by introducing sailing to the general public. As a co-founder of OCSC, literally thousands of members of the general public learned about sailing and got hooked on our sport under the watchful eye of Rich Jepsen. That using education, competition, and equal opportunity can grow our sport is most promising. So it is with great pleasure that I introduce longtime friend and respected leader, Rich Jepsen. Rich, welcome to the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon.
Thank you very much, Ron.
I recognize that you also have an additional handicap. In addition to being a sailor, you even owned an International One design for many years.
Yes. Not a wonderful way to spend your money other than the fact that it's such a joy to sail.
Those of us who have been bitten by the sailing bug all acknowledge that the difference between pouring money down a hole and sailing is that one is wetter than the other.
Indeed.
Let's hear a bit about your orientation to the sport and a bit about yourself for those folks who haven't the benefit of knowing what a good and thoughtful career you've had.
I got my start in sailing in a non-traditional way. Our family was a middle-class family, and just about every nickel that was left over after paying the mortgage and feeding the kids was put into my dad's boat. So that was our recreation when I was a kid, and family sailing was how I was introduced. I never was in a junior program. We never belonged to a yacht club. There are things that I feel connected me to sailing better because of that unique or sort of unusual introduction to sailing. And I'll talk about a few of those things today. Today, folks, I'm going to talk about growing the sport. Now, why should we grow the sport? Isn't it fine the way it is? Some people could make that case. Certainly, if you're in the J70 fleet and you have 50 boats on the line, just about every regatta, you say, well, is there even room for more? And when you see 140 lasers in Lake Garda in the World Championship, you say, gosh, seems like sailing is healthy. And I'm here to say that it is healthy, healthier than it was 10 years ago, but it can be healthier. And there's lots of benefits that accrue to all of us if our sport continues to grow. I just want to talk a little bit about U.S. sailing first. U.S. sailing celebrating its 125th anniversary of its existence in one form or another. It went from NARU to USRU and then on to U.S. sailing in recent decades. And it operated for 100 years as a representative body for racing sailors. That's all it did. Did the racing rules and represented different regions of the country in terms of rules about running races and sailing races. In only recent decades, though, when it changed its name, it became a service organization for all of sailing. Now, most recently, we've undergone a wrenching cultural and organizational change. It includes the dissolution of the Olympic Sailing Committee and replacing oversight of the Olympic effort, handing that to the board of directors. And we've had a wholesale refreshment of the executive staff leadership. That's led to some painful discussions, some difficult challenges, but also these incredible opportunities and some early successes. And we do have a long way to go to realize the vision that we have that's outlined in our strategic plan. You can find that on the website. But we've upgraded our foundation, our Olympic department, our membership and programs and services departments. It's a super exciting time. So today, I'm going to give you a little bit more background, a little bit of important news about U.S. sailing, and then what I consider to be the big three for growing the sport: education and sail training, competition, and diversity. As I said, I started sailing as a 5-year-old on the family Crosby catboat in Charles River in Boston. And when I grew up, I got introduced to teaching sailing and have spent 40 years in sail training, teaching kids and adults all aspects of sailing, from seamanship and navigation to day sailing and racing. 1995, I started volunteering for US Sailing. It's been 27 years. I've had 3 board stints, but this is my first as its board president. So education was critical to growing the sport. And the reason is, for every person who is a do-it-yourselfer, bought a boat, taught themselves, got a book, looked at some videos, or just sailed with friends until they felt like they had figured it out, there are 10 people who can never make it that far. They won't have the confidence, and they won't develop a lifelong love for sailing because it'll always be a bit of a train wreck and a little bit scary. And training and competence and confidence solves for that. And in our busy lives, we can't spend 10 years before getting confident enough to feel we can go out in all sorts of weather. Another part of it is age-based curriculums are underutilized in America, in youth sailing especially, where many youth sail training curriculums are developed by adults based on adults' sense of how they learn themselves. And insufficient amount of time is spent thinking about what kids want, how they learn, what their attention span limits are. And that's one of the things that we're working very hard on a number of fronts to change, and you'll hear a little bit more about that. But most importantly, ask the kids what they want and give them agency on their own education. Kids are often not listened to because the coach or the parent assumes that they couldn't possibly know as much as the coach or the parent. But sometimes kids will surprise you, and letting them know that they have control of their own destiny is a great way to keep them engaged. Finally, I'll make a pitch for the 2 most effective professional development programs for sailing leaders and sail training leaders in America: the Sailing Leadership Forum and the National Sailing Program Symposium. Each of those runs late January, early February every year. They alternate with each other, and they're an incredible way to improve by at least double your understanding of what a successful sail training program or a race admin program or a board leadership effort of a yacht club would be. Also, with the generous funding from the Tom and Stacy SIEBEL Foundation, we're revolutionizing the youth entry model for sailing. With a national curriculum developed by youth development experts in partnership with our instructional design team, US Sailing's rolled this out to public access programs around the country. And I want to share a few slides about SIEBEL because it's transforming the effort to keep kids in sailing, and you'll hear a little bit about that a little later. I love competition. I started out sailing as a cruising sailor. I got introduced to racing sailboats late in life, probably in my late 20s, but it's the majority of the sailing that I do, and certainly one of the reasons that I'm still immersed in the sport. US Sailing's doing more than just leading local training organizations to better serve their students. We're also working hard on making competition more fun for kids and more fun for adults, but kids is where the great leverage is. So I've asked coaches all around the country over and over again, what works to get kids to fall in love with sailing? And the overriding answers are, most important, the kids are with their friends and on the boat with their friends. Second most, they want to feel safe. And third most, they need to have unstructured playtime on boats initially. To fall in love with sailing, it needs to be less structured than currently it is around the country in youth racing programs. And another common thread, kids are different from one another. So what works for one kid's not going to work for another. A small minority of kids fall in love with competition immediately. In fact, they're more interested in the competition than maybe they are even in sailing. The majority of kids, though, can fall in love with competition, but only after they fall in love with sailing. And then there's, of course, another small minority unlikely to ever enjoy racing, but being on a boat with friends is still fun. This calls for going easy on kids with windward, leeward, roll tacking and starting drills, and thinking about boat tag and adventure sails and water fights and other such unstructured play that allows them to really enjoy the art and science of sailing. Last one is intergenerational sailing. I referred to that when I was talking about my own experience. Family sailing was intergenerational sailing for me. What I learned about sailing then was this is an adult activity that I'm being allowed to do rather than a youth activity that I'll likely age out of. Right now, few adults find room on their boats, or kids, or certainly teens. And several regattas incentivize boats for having kids, and that's moved the needle a little bit, but insufficient. I think there needs to be a cultural change where the whole idea of sailing being unique because kids and teens can sail on a level playing field with adults, which is hard to do when you're playing soccer or football or baseball or basketball. While I did sail any boat I could get my hands on with other kids, with other, with adults in the neighborhood, what really bonded me to sailing was not only the intergenerational aspect, but because I was with family. The fact that we were sharing that as a family really increased our bonds as a family, but more importantly, it increased my bond with sailing. And it's a very common thread when I talk to people my own age about their experience as kids. Almost always it comes up with, the thing I remember most about falling in love with sailing is sailing with my parents. And so I think we need to get back to a culture where we promote and celebrate that, and more parents are willing to do more than just drop their kids off at the junior program. We know sailing can be very expensive. Ron and I were just talking about that regarding the IOD fleet. And in today's economy, with tuition debt, home prices, et cetera, it's making it harder for young adults to get their feet under them. Enter club-owned boats. The St. Francis has been a leader here with its J22 fleet. We need to do more of that so that we can keep young adults in sailing until they can afford to own their own boat. Many of those sailors, youth sailors, fail to come back to sailing simply because the only reasonable route being provided to them is to own a boat, and they really can't justify that when they're starting a family and they have college debt. Scholastic and college sailing has a little bit of an infrastructure problem because it's underutilized by the local or the college team or the high school team. They have equipment, they have some infrastructure, they have coaches, and partnering with yacht clubs and community sailing programs, both for boat storage and launching, but also having an agreement to have that equipment utilized more often, has a great chance to get a lot more kids involved in sailing and eventually better populate those high school and college teams. Lastly, the FJ and the Club 420, the Opti are enormously successful and dependable platforms for junior, high school, and college sailing. In some respects, however, they are victims of their own success because they're affordable, because they're all the same, because they're underpowered. They provide a certain type of platform that really works for a certain portion of a high school or college student's career. What we're finding is that college students are doing so much sailing on these boats, the number of times that they get to sail on more exciting boats is limited. So they're not learning how to foil, they're not learning how to kite surf or wing sail. They're not sailing on 5.0s or I-14s or WASPs or 29ers. And I think there needs to be a top-down attempt to create an opportunity for those high school and college students to cross-train on some of these more exciting boats. Keep the 420s and keep the FJs, but allow for some cross-training. Right now, the schedule for most high school and college teams doesn't allow for much opportunity to do that. It's almost a year-round, it's a late spring, summer, and early fall thing for the northern states, and it's a year-round thing for the southern sailing locations.
Which boats do you like in exciting boats in this category? Which classes?
The 29er is the most popular of that type of class because it's mass produced and a feeder for the 49er and the 49er FX. And those are Olympic classes. So, and it's more affordable than either of those two boats. The WASP has gained a lot of traction. It's still less popular, fewer sales than the 29er. But again, a boat that is hard to sail, but super exciting to sail. And then, of course, boarding has exploded in popularity. But it has yet to really make an impact at the high school level. It's usually folks who are either in college or have finished college, and it becomes their personal recreation, partly due to its portability and partly due to its affordability. Diversity. So we've been talking a lot in this country about diversity, and the acronym DEI is for diversity, equity, and inclusion. I want to make a case for improving sailing's DEI. First, I just want to do a little bit of background. I'll just say that diversity is having diverse people at the party, and inclusion is having diverse people invited to dance. The one is a metric and the other is an effort. And so whenever you're talking about DEI to your friends, I encourage you to remember that diversity is the goal, equity and inclusion are the instruments. So in addition to making sure that we're open and welcoming, we also want to be recruiters. And we're only going to be recruiters if we see value in it for the sport and our own organizations. That's a hard job. We'll have to recruit more than just be available. Historically, we've looked at inclusion as being available, not actively excluding people. But in point of fact, after 100 years of women and people of color being excluded from sailing, we're going to have to shout from the rooftops that we're open and eager to have them join our tribe. Also, we have to make it more affordable. And I've talked about that a little bit on other slides in the competition slide. Club-owned boats, perfectly good way of doing it. The SIEBEL program, which I'm going to talk about in a second, is the single biggest thing in the history of US sailing to come across to greatly increase the numbers of sailors in this country and to greatly increase the diversity of those sailors. The nominating committee is furiously evaluating candidates to populate our committees, our foundation, our board, and our staff at headquarters, looking for quality individuals who are also diverse, not to tick a box, but because diverse perspectives in leadership lead to different paths, different strategic plans, different priorities. And in order for us to grow the sport through diversity, we need to have those voices in the room. We're also working from the grassroots. We're going to majority minority clubs to talk to their memberships about what do they know about how diverse people activate around sailing that we don't know as a dramatically majority white and male organization. We're educating our local sailing volunteers on best practices for DEI. We hold quarterly seminars on the art and science of organizational culture change to embrace inclusion of diverse people, making sure that there are procedures in place to make entry more equitable for previously underserved communities. And as I said, the SIEBEL Sailors Program, generous funding from Tom and Stacy SIEBEL Foundation, I think it's the biggest boost to youth sailing since Timmy Lahr, Gary Jobson, and Dave Perry created our youth training from whole cloth back in 1984, 6 years after the Ted Stevens Sports Act. So let me talk to you about SIEBEL. Almost 3 years ago, US Sailing proposed to the Tom and Stacy SIEBEL Foundation a national sailing program for youth to increase diversity, distribute professional guidelines for youth sail training, keep more kids in sailing for a lifetime, and dramatically increase participation from diverse communities. The foundation signed on with an initial grant of $2.5 million, and US Sailing got to work. From whole cloth, we created a national network using the operational model developed by experts from within and without US Sailing. The mission is more of a sort of vision and tenets slide, but you can see they all serve the mission of growing the sport through the proper introduction of and outreach to diverse communities. This is a racing program, but I will say that one of the first things we do is we work on the kids' resilience, their leadership, their problem solving, their ethics, their interpersonal skills, and we use something that psychologists now call social emotional learning. So it's completely different than the average youth training program here, and US Sailing's been so impressed with the results that it is now stealing a lot of the operational tenets of the SIEBEL curriculum so that it can provide it for all schools, whether or not they're on a SIEBEL program. These are the guiding principles, and these are the things we're teaching the kids, but also reminding our coaches that we consider them most important. Most programs have racing success at the top of that list, or trophies at the top of that list. But what we've learned through the research that we did with child development professionals is racing and the actual competition needs to be way down the list, at least at first, until we get the kids to fall in love with sailing. Let me draw your attention to the last one. This is similar to what I was saying before. This is the magic sauce of the program. Like successful businesses, youth training programs greatly improve if they're asking their students what they want, then figuring out how to give it to them. SIEBEL Sailors proved that model for youth sailing, and we're rolling it out to the rest of the youth community. Last year, we traveled to Redwood City to pitch Tom SIEBEL on doubling down on his commitment so we could greatly expand this proven successful pilot. He'd done his homework, complimented us on what he thought was a great performance against his personal KPIs for us, and also on our reputation in the community. He really heard great things about SIEBEL no matter who he talked to. He very quickly, in 15 minutes, agreed to give up another $5 million as a match challenge for 2022. The pilot called for a fully funded, thoroughly trained SIEBEL coach to lead the program at the 5 regional SIEBEL hubs nationwide, identified by the white sailboats on this screen. With the new fund, should we succeed in raising the entire $5 million match, we'll double the number of regions and double the number of centers in each region, and then double the number of coaches at each center. That'll more quickly train the local coaches in the SIEBEL Sailors way. So you can see that when we first were operational, nationwide, we only trained 252 sailors. Last year, it was 787. This year, it's headed well north of 2,500. And we expect to be at 7,500 annual youth sailors within the next 3 years. We have over 50 programs interested in becoming SIEBEL Sailor facilities and are working hard on the fundraising and the development. If you're asking, how can I help? Consider finding a comfortable way to give. You can pledge over years, and the entire pledge will count against the match in 2022. I've made a multi-year pledge, and I'm also using planned giving to help that match in a way that otherwise would be difficult for me to do financially. Planned giving pledges qualify against the match as well in their entirety, regardless of the timeline. This program has the ability to change youth sailing permanently and for good. Benefits will accrue to our racing community. Yes, it's a racing program, but as I said, it initially focuses on building strong young adults. It'll bring that to our industry, to our clubs and schools as we expand sailing's footprint into places it has never been. In case you're interested, let me share my email address. It's just my full name at ussailing.org. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have. And if you're activated to support this revolutionary program, consider going to donate at SIEBELmatch.org. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for all of your effort. And a couple of things on diversity. I would argue that one of the reasons why American culture is so fascinating and constantly changing is because of the diversity of our culture. You know, we look at food and music and movies and clothing. Our culture keeps benefiting by the diversity of our population. We keep adding new elements to what makes Americans entertaining because we have this incredibly diverse culture. I think you're making the case that one of the reasons why we ought to do the same with sailing is because it'll become a greater sport, a more successful sport, if we in fact listen to other voices in our game.
Yes, well said. Sailing suffers both in numbers and in perspective just because it is so provincial and so white and so male. We've been making great strides with adding women to our sport. It was probably 10% 30 years ago of sailors were women. Now it's 30%. But imagine how healthy our sport would be if sailing's gender demographics reflected America's. And we're well on the way. We're only 20% away. We got a lot longer slog with people of color and the LGBTQ community, the differently abled community, but we benefit from that. We sell more sales, there's more boats on the line, we have a greater voice in government for sailor-friendly regulations. We become a bigger part of the conversation when we're talking about the USOPC on the Olympic side. And the early diversity efforts that we're making are already returning value to us in all the learnings that we're having and all the perspectives that we get from our diverse colleagues. Almost 50% of our board for the past 10 years has been women. And that has dramatically changed the board, the way it thinks, the way it discusses things, how it approaches our mission, from the days when it was 70% men and 30% women on the board back in the 90s.
Another interesting aspect of sailing is that it is learning by doing, and you learn a lot in sailing without books. You can learn all about physics, literally, by sailing a sailboat. Nobody says riding moment your first day out sailing, but you discover about riding moment, you discover about leverage, and you discover about the purchase system in block and tackles. And every race down the breeze is really an adventure in trigonometry. You know, you go a little bit faster if you hot up the boat, but you're not getting closer to the mark, et cetera, et cetera. Right. And people learn all about weather without opening a weather book. In a way, sailing is one long problem-solving exercise.
Yeah, thank you. It's one of the more cerebral sports that I've played. And while sailing was my first love, I was like most kids in the 60s and 70s. I was on the football team, I was on the hockey team, played baseball, and all of those have cerebral aspects to them, but none of them holds a candle to what you have to know to be successful in sailing, whether you're racing or cruising. Every college coach I've talked to says, of all the athletes on scholarship at my school, the average sailor is smarter than the average, big three sports scholarship athlete. I don't have a metric for it, but it happens to be true. I like I said, I think you need to factor out what is still true about sailing, which is if you're on a sailing scholarship at a college, especially an elite college, you a 90% chance you came from a fairly well-off family. So of course, those kids enjoy privileges and step-ups that many in our country do not. So, but I still think sailing itself, for you to be successful in sailing, if you can't get your arms around physics and weather and biology and sports psychology, it's going to be hard to be successful at a high level.
You're the third St. Francis Yacht Club member to be head of what is effectively U.S. Sailing. So talk to us a little bit about your West Coast orientation and this sort of non-exclusive but broad scope about how you could change sailing to be a big, big sport.
I'm really pleased to be the first West Coast board president in decades, and I'm very proud that I would be elected. When I first started volunteering at U.S. Sailing in 1995, we had a well-deserved reputation of being, in fact, Northeast-centric. The headquarters was there, 75% of the board members were from there. Most of the policies were driven by stakeholders in Portland, Maine to Annapolis, Maryland corridor. Obviously, people like me and my business partner, Anthony, and Don Durant of Club Nautique, and even the folks at the St. Francis now, to include Paul Kayard, who's the executive director of Olympic Sailing, actively went about trying to change that. And what we found was it was easier to do than we thought. We thought it was an effort to sort of gather everything, all the benefits to accrue to this small group of people, and that it was being done out of self-interest. And in point of fact, it was just being done out of ignorance. And they didn't know what we needed. They didn't know to ask. And once we got involved in the leadership of the organization, it became very easy to draw and recruit all sorts of really smart people who live in California, from Katie Pettibone to JJ Fetter to Teresa Davis, and a long list. Charlie Arms, who's a Californian, even though she lives in Annapolis now. And that changed the direction of the organization. And it's that model that I am confident will further develop us if we get the same perspectives from diverse populations that we're not getting now. I mentioned women are 50% of the board. We have entirely different meetings than before we had women in any sort of numbers on the board. Entirely different, and we're focusing on entirely different issues that would never come up when it was, mostly guys on the board. So what if we have a board that better reflects the demography of America? Don't we get sort of the conversation from that black sailor from New Orleans who says, there's 2 majority black yacht clubs down here that have nothing to do with US sailing. Why is that? Why can't we go and talk to them and get them into the fold and learn from them and serve them and provide value and benefit to them? I'm really looking forward to that day, and we're working hard as we can to find those slots so that people of color have positions of responsibility at the top of the organization.
What are your own personal KPIs? What are the key performance indicators that you would use to evaluate? Your term is going to be 3 years.
I have a bunch of them assigned to the strategic plan, which is 3 main pillars. There's sustained high performance, international and Olympic success. There's membership, growth, and service is where the DEI piece is, the diversity piece. And I want to see US sailing better reflect the demography at the top, as I was talking about, but also better reflect it at the grassroots level. I want private clubs to become more open to people regardless how they self-identify. I want the community to recognize how helpful this will be. I want a 50% female presence on the board to continue. Right now it's a little less, but I want at least 2 people of color on the board next year. And I want that to be not a quota, but an aspiration that we work hard at every year. We replace 2 to 3 board members who term out every year. And I want those spots to go as often to diverse candidates as they do to the group that we've historically got, which is, the current president's friend or colleague or competitor who happens to be the same gender and skin color as the president. So
what a coincidence.
Yes. Those are 2 KPIs that I feel strongly about. The next KPI is winning multiple medals in at least half of the classes in LA.
The Los Angeles Olympics in 2028.
Yes. In addition to that, I want to get the organization on a financial footing with the help of our deeply experienced executive CEO, Alan Osfield, to create endowment for the Olympic program, to fund the SIEBEL program so that we are able to do everything. One of the things that we were stuck doing in the years past was, we'd love to do that, we don't have the money. We'd love to do that, it's not in the budget. Well, all business people know that the solution to that is top line revenue. And some of that is corporate sponsorship. Some of it is sailor generosity. Some of it is programs and services. And some of it is operating effectively and efficiently. And Alan said it very well. He's been in sports management and entertainment management his whole career. He said, you guys aren't doing enough to grow top line revenue. You're satisfied with this number and it hasn't grown in years. That's not how you run a business. And I don't care if you're a nonprofit. The only difference between nonprofit and a business is what you do with the money that's left over after you've spent everything. So he says, I want us to do everything. I don't want us to focus and cut out programs. We're not in the business of slashing programs. We're in the business of expanding. And so if we can expand our membership through diversity and through winning back people's faith in us as a national governing body, and we convince corporate sponsors that this new growth in membership and new growth in sailing is going to continue. All paths lead to good things. And each one of these things helps the other a little bit. So if we work a little bit on all of these top line issues, then we'll be able to double our revenue in the next 5 years. And then all of the programs that are less than they could be will get the funding that they need so that we can have our REACH STEM and sailing program, instead of being in 10, 15, 20 programs around the country, and all 1,300 public access sailing programs and all 1,500 private yacht club junior programs. That, you know, that's true leadership. That's what we should be doing, instead of this sort of, you know, building the airplane while we fly it, which is what we've been doing for years before.
Give us some of the metrics around U.S. sailing. How many members? What's been the growth rate in the past, and what are the demographics?
The demographics are 70% male, 30% female. There's one demographic. It's about 95% white people, 2% Black sailors, 5% Latino. And I don't have numbers for LGBTQ or differently abled, but you can see they're well below the demography of America, and lots of opportunity there, lots of growth. We're sitting at 40,000 members. We're back on a growth pattern because it did dip below 40,000 there for a while, and we're back up. We just hired a new a membership director from the water polo world who has deep amount of experience in subscription sales and membership sales, and has got great ideas that are going to, I think, revitalize our member offerings and energize the members so they know that not only are they getting benefits, but they're also part of something bigger than themselves, which we had been uninterested in doing in decades past.
What's the annual budget, and give us a percentages source of revenue?
Two parts of the organization, roughly. There's the Olympic budget and then the association's budget. And it's all part of the same pool, but I'll talk about Olympic budget first. Olympic budget has limped along at $4 million a year for a long time. And that proved to be insufficient for us to be competitive once IOC changed the rules and now professionals were allowed into the sport. All of our competitors, Britain, Australia, New Zealand, France, Netherlands, all pivoted, found ways to fund their sailing teams like professional sports teams. America didn't, right? And US Sailing, as the national governing body for the sport, you know, bears some responsibility for that. Recognizing that, we set about a revitalization of the Olympic program. It's called Project Pinnacle, developed by Paul Kayard, who's now the executive director, Bill Rue, Brian Keane, and on loan, we got 2 All-American sailors from Ivy League schools who work as consultants for McKinsey, and they did a 6-month-long study on how we return to international competitive excellence, and it's called Project Pinnacle. Its financial metric is to grow our budget from $4 million a year to $10 million a year. And that's all being done with corporate sponsorship and private donations. A small amount of money comes from the USOPC because they give you money based on your previous quads performance, and we've underperformed these last 2 quads, so that's really an insignificant amount of money.
How much is it?
About 800,000 last year. Paul and Bill have already raised 50% more than we have ever raised in our history in a year. And he's in his first year. So the rest of the organization is around $5 million. And although we don't need to grow it as fast as Paul and Bill need to grow theirs, we do want to get it to $8 million a year here in the next 5 years. And if we can get the top line budget number to be $8 million, then there's a list as long as my arm for all the cool things that we can do for the sailing community if we just have the resources.
Let's take the $5 million that's coming from corporate and what comes from membership. What are the sources of revenue?
Yeah, membership probably makes up, say, 40% of our non-Olympic revenue stream. Corporate partnerships make up another 30%, programs and services, 30%.
In terms of management of the organization, so there's the board and there's the paid staff. Give us sort of an overview of each of those. How many, and the board is volunteer members and the paid staff, a professional hired paid staff. So tell us the numbers in each.
We have a board of 14 plus ex officio members, Paul and Alan. The CEO and the executive director of Olympic Sailing are both non-voting members on the board, so 16 of us all together. At current count, 58 employees, about 50 of whom are in Bristol, Rhode Island at the headquarters at Roger Williams University, and 8 are working remotely.
The org structure of the volunteers?
There are board committees and then ad hoc committees. The board committees are the standard nonprofit committees you'd expect: nominating, governance, bylaws, audit. There's one for sailor athlete selection to the Olympic team. And then a bunch of ad hoc committees: education committee, race admin committee, championships committee, offshore, safety at sea, community sailing, commercial sailing. There's 57 committees, which interestingly, even though we're not the biggest NGB, we have the most committees of any NGB, which is in itself a bit of a problem. And so we're going to tackle that and see how we can streamline this in a way that energizes our volunteers, our committee volunteers, and doesn't have anyone feel like, hey, you're taking away my committee. No, we want to move you to this new committee that's doing both this job and that job, because they're so similar. We shouldn't have volunteers doing the same job, but just pointed in slightly different directions. So that's a project under organizational effectiveness that's ongoing this summer.
Now, the organizational structure of the paid staff.
The paid staff is led by a CEO and by the executive director of Olympic Sailing. The executive director of Olympic Sailing reports to the CEO and directly to the board. They're at the head of the organization. Then under them are the senior vice president of programs and services, and he's responsible for our adult department, our youth department, our education department, and our race admin department. Oh, and offshore. So he's all of our programs and services that we provide our sailors are under Alan's purview. Then under partnerships and marketing, we have chief marketing officer, Eric, and he is in charge of corporate partnerships, of our communications vehicle and instrument, and also the collaboration between membership, marketing, and corporate. Under Eric are Hannah for membership, Josh for marketing, and they've just made a new hire, someone named Mitchell for communications, who will work directly under him. And then, probably in all of those big baskets, 30 of the 57 employees, 30 or 40 of them work in roles, everything from instructional design expert to racing rules expert to youth advocacy person. John Pierce, who's been there for a long time, a former college coach, who's responsible for everything that has to do with youth sailing, whether it's training or competition.
So what a great and organized overview you've given us at U.S. Sailing, Rich. Thanks so much, from the sailing community's perspective for your career advancing the sport of sailing across the country, first through all your educational efforts and then all your volunteer efforts and now your leadership efforts at U.S. Sailing. It's really refreshing to hear such a sort of powerful and comprehensive approach to growing our game, growing our sport. Really enjoyed having you as a guest speaker on the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon, and thanks very much for being our guest.
Thank you, and stay tuned for great things.
Exactly, great. Thanks, Rich. See you, mate. Bye.
has been a presentation of the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon.